So, how do you start working with someone, particularly if they've either been diagnosed with ADHD or you can see that they've got many traits that means they would probably get a diagnosis?
Yeah, to be honest, most people come either haven't got a diagnosis or aren't aware of it themselves. So I start with, okay, I can spot these traits, and I'm going to assume someone is ADHD, and I'm not going to bring that into discussion yet, to be honest, because one of the most important things with working with eating disorders is to help that person be their own identity. So I'm looking for that first and foremost with someone in amongst the exercise, the eating, the body image. Who is this person? So that can be really helpful when someone is neurodivergent to even just see them as them, getting to know how they tick. Find out, I kind of do a lot of finding a lot of data, and building a relationship and then working with it. And I'm always looking through the food and through the body image and through the exercise to understand, well, who are they aside from this? If that makes sense.
Totally. What data are you looking for?
So I was once a statistician. I'm autistic as well, so it's like, like love the data. Data about their behaviors, their habits, their beliefs, their relationships, things that they like, things they don't like. So when we're talking about food, for instance, it'd be like, what foods do you like? What foods don't you like? So that really helps me understand, is this the eating disorder in terms of it's safe foods, they're maybe lower calorie or easier, like vegetables, these kind of things, keeping away from certain food groups? Is it a textural thing? So perhaps this is part of their neurodivergence. And find it out in terms of sport. If coming to me, if they're an athlete or fitness professional, I work a lot with fitness professionals as well. It's like, okay, what does exercise mean to you? So really kind of trying to sift out the real person and the patterns within the exercise or the food. Okay, what part of this seems like an eating disorder to me? When did it start? So I do a lot of talking and asking to begin with around it
Yeah.
all before we even deal with it. Yeah.
I think patterns are really interesting. One of the things that when I interviewed athletes in the book said they can see patterns in a way that neurotypical people
Mm.
often can't. And you're looking for those patterns too. Do, do you find that you're explaining those patterns back to them? Does that help with their understanding of what's going on with their eating disorder?
Yeah, so often, like I mean, I literally do always feel like I gather the data, find the pattern, and reflect it back. But within that, significant underneath the discussions about the food behaviors that I'll ask them about and just kind of link it into maybe the behavior. And often that'll be that the person's not really clocked that, oh yeah, I started doing, I don't know, I started restricting, I started eating more when this happened. So and that can help them. First of all, it can help them understand that there's a reason for this. It's
Yeah.
not just come from nowhere, and it's not their fault. There's always a reason for it. It's a coping strategy. So to try and help someone see the pattern of where that coping strategies come from and why it might make sense can be really helpful for them. And also to acknowledge we're not going to take it away straight away, which can seem like often people around, if they're aware that they've got an eating disorder, try to take it away from them. It's like, well, it's here for a reason. So let's look at different coping strategies rather than we've got to get rid of this one. So that can be really kind of grounding and stabilizing for someone as well to recognize this is okay. I'm accepted here. Yes, we will deal with it, but we're not going to suddenly take it away. Even if there's a desire for that person to not have it, particularly if it's binging
Mm.
or purging, which are the really distressing ones, it kept we kind of put a lot of compassion around it and understanding around it before changing it in any way, shape, or form.
Amazing. What are you talk about binging and purging there? Are there specific types of disordered eating that you see showing up more with athletes who have ADHD?
Yeah, definitely. So ADHD would tend towards binging or purging or binging and then restricting. Um, and and chewing and spitting can be one that comes with that as well. So it kind of ingesting the foods but not taking the food but not ingesting it. So that often comes with ADHD because it gives that sensation, it gives that taste, it gives that hit, but it's not being ingested for the perceived calories that will come with it, although it's not as simple as that. They often are ingested. Um, so yeah, it tends to be more on that or going a period of time without eating, whether it's because they've forgotten or they've just got really kind of engrossed in something and then binging as a result of that. Or not managing their training loads so that they're under fueling and then they're binging at some point because their body is just absolutely craving nutrition. So that tends to come with ADHD. Restrictive, sort of those purely restrictive one tends to come more with autism. But it can be so where you've got autism and ADHD mixed together, you could have restriction and binging, a restriction and purging. But definitely more that kind of binge side of it that comes with ADHD.
Do you think any of that comes from medication? So one of the elements that lots of athletes talk about with the medication is that it's an appetite suppressant. And obviously that's
Mhm.
going to be really tricky if you are training significant hours, but yet once you've taken your meds in the morning, that's 8 hours of not feeling hungry. Do you see that showing up as an issue?
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. To be fair, I don't work with a lot of athletes on medication. I do tend to get people before they're aware of ADHD, so they're not on medication. But I do work with people who I'm so lucky. I work with a team of people who seem to cover like the nutrition, the medication side of things, and it's so common for that to happen. So we'll talk about setting timers for people because they have to fuel, they have to take it. But yeah, it's just kind of my understanding. It just suppresses the appetite. So they are underfueling, which can obviously have its own problems when somebody's underfueling, they're not then getting the nutrition in. And if they're kind of intentionally restricting, it can lead them into deficit. It can lead them into a place which can begin to look like anorexia, although it comes from the brain not getting enough fueling. So going into that kind of reds area.
Yeah. And how much
Yeah.
education around that side are you offering? Because sometimes, particularly if someone with REDS, we often call it like um, the accidental eating disorder, because
Yeah.
often it is around I just wanted to be as fast as I could be or as light as I could be in order to perform at this level. And I didn't realize that it would get me into this spiral and it would be so difficult to get out of it. Are you
Yeah.
able to do that education? Do you find that's welcome?
Yeah, absolutely. I think education through eating disorders it just plays a role the whole way through recovery, sort of from beginning to end. And I particularly find it with athletes that if they understand, they're like, okay, I can get a reason for it. So I will talk to them about why it happens, what happens with the body, what happens with the brain then. So they're not going to have that same cognitive function. And when the body goes into like when the brain starts to go into starvation, you go into those thinking patterns as well, which means they're not focused on their sport, they're focused on the food or the restriction of food. So it's just making their performance worse on all levels, physically, mentally, emotionally. So yeah, absolutely. I do quite a lot of like psych ed or education throughout it at different times, depending on where the person's at, what's particularly happening with that day. But I kind of feel like it's the because so much of what I do is quite, you're dealing with a person's sort of sense of identity and self-concept a lot of the time, and that can seem a bit woolly for some people. And then if you can kind of thread it under with this kind of solid education, it can feel like they can land some of the softer concepts on top of that as well. Particularly for a brain that's looking for, like, I need to know, I need to understand that, yeah, it can just kind of help them make sense of it, as opposed to me kind of going through some solid structure with them. This is what it must look like. We're just kind of working with the points with where it's helpful for their brain to make sense of it. Yeah.
Because something on your website I loved, you had a phrase about how you help those you work with to be more at ease within themselves. And that felt one,
Mm.
very compassionate, but two, there's a stat that came up. when I was writing the book around someone with ADHD is likely to have been told off 20,000 more times by the age of 10 because they've been moving too much or they've been just told off constantly for moving or talking or doing things in a way that a teacher doesn't think they should be done. And that's going to be very shaming. That's going to make them feel very different, very like they stand out. So your approach of like, well, how do I make someone feel more at ease with themselves just feels a lovely way to help, I guess, get that real identity from them.
Yeah, absolutely. And because I came into eating disorder recovery, helping people before I really understood neurodivergence. Before I knew I was neurodivergent, I now know I'm autistic ADHD, so that makes sense. But so I think I already had this kind of sense of I just want the person to feel at ease because what an eating disorder does is it steals identity. Like ultimately, an eating disorder's purpose is to take over someone's identity and extinguish the self. Like ultimately that's its role. And so to bring that person out to understand the self, you're already finding a force against the eating disorder. When you take it, regardless of the habits, the behaviors, or anything, if you can kind of help somebody be their core self, you're building a massive kind of what's the word I'm looking for? Energy against the eating disorder.
Mm.
Yeah. But a person's forgotten that. So to start with, when someone comes into the room, I'm like, they can be themselves. You can't see my right, it's got fidget toys all over the place and stuff like
Brilliant.
that. My seats move, they spin. So someone can sit and fidget. We get down on the floor, we do anything. And that in itself is just a huge important part of it. So for someone to come in and I'm always looking for how can I reach this person? How can I get to understand them? And then we'll talk about the eating disorder. And of course we have to talk about that. But that's why I do a lot of data gathering. And because someone who's ADHD, exactly like you say, they'll have spent a lot of their life fighting against who they are to fit in,
Mm.
not feeling good enough because they're told that, or there'll be a whole load of core beliefs that will go on. I'm stupid, I'm not good enough, I'm incapable, I'm lazy. These are quite sort of typical things I hear people with ADHD, which is where people become more susceptible to an eating disorder because you don't have an eating disorder if you've got self-esteem.
Yeah.
So it basically kind of gets into like a fragile sense of self and self-esteem. So to let someone be themselves in a space with me and kind of and recognize that, well, this is their way of processing. And that's what I do a lot of. I'll often say to people, oh, the way I'm hearing your brain works is how about if we do it this way? I can't give concrete examples because everyone's different,
Yeah.
but it is that kind of, okay, now I understand how you process. Does that make sense? So I'm always asking them if it makes sense and would that be okay? Would that make sense for you? And so by asking them, I'm learning and then I'm kind of catching up on them. And then we work out how are we going to attack this eating disorder? How are we going to make these changes that are not just put on because I've told them how to do it, but
Yeah.
because they truly believe this would be the way forward and it would help them.
The way you talk about it there is it sounds like you're talking about an eating disorder as a thing, something quite concrete, substantial that
Uh-huh.
you're battling against,
Yeah.
you're dealing with. Is that how you describe it? Is it?
Mhm.
Some people will talk about like naming it.
Um,
Um,
Mm. I hadn't thought about it quite till you said it there, but yeah, I guess I am. And some therapists will name the eating disorder. I personally don't, just because it never made sense for me in my recovery. So I often kind of like feel a bit kind of I understand what I do, but actually I'm just kind of making sense of this now. Why don't I? One something with neurodivergent people, and sorry, let me step back. In anorexia particularly, we often talk about the voice. There's
yeah,
like an anorexic voice. Neurodivergent people don't always see it as that. It's too conceptual for some people. For some people, it makes complete sense. For others, it's a bit too conceptual. So I guess with someone, I'm like, how do they see it? So some people might see it as a metaphor. Some people might see it as it's just these behaviors that I need to deal with and I need to work on, and we're kind of chipping away at them bit by bit. I see it as something that's kind of come into the person's space, come into the person's life to cope. So I see it purely as a coping strategy. And how can we find other ones? And how can we make that not the go-to coping strategy? And how can we eventually mean it's not a coping strategy at all?
I love that approach. And I love the idea. I've seen this work really well where you are talking about it worked for a while. This was a coping strategy that you picked up upon. It worked for a while. There's no shame in the fact that you picked this up. It had a purpose, but now
Mhm.
it's no longer serving you. Now it's harming you. So we need to find different coping mechanisms. How do you help someone start to find those coping mechanisms? And particularly thinking about the ADHD need for dopamine and that constant craving for dopamine, is that something you're able to build into finding new coping mechanisms?
Yeah, yeah. So we start to look at where the coping mechanism isn't working here, or where the coping mechanism becomes the first go-to, whereas actually there's something that's a more sustainable coping strategy. So, for instance, going to binging because I'm bored, I've not eaten, I just want the hit from the foods. These kind of things where it's like a quick hit dopamine, or it's the response to an emotion. How can I deal with this emotion? Okay, I can go to food and I can binge. So what we would look at is what I would call surfing the urge.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's almost like a coming back from it. So there's a place where it's like they're in it, they're doing it, or afterwards they're like, I've just done that. What have I done? So you're constantly sort of coming back. Okay, next time this happens, which is why it's really important to begin with to not try and stop it, to accept this is going to happen again. How about we do it with more, have more awareness next time? Okay, it happened. Let's look at why it happened. What was going on? Well, I was bored and I turned to food and I didn't have anything else. I was feeling really fidgety and antsy and I didn't know what to do. So I started picking at food, and before I knew it, it was a binge. So we worked back from that to eventually get to the place where they recognize, for instance, I'm bored, I'm antsy, I don't know what to do, I'm feeling dysregulated, I'm going to go to food. Oh, what can I do next? They might still not be able to do anything, but at least they're aware when they go to it, or they can surf that urge. And it's usually just at that point that we can go, okay, what else might be more appropriate here? What can you do to surf that urge? Could you go and do something that's a bit longer term purposeful, a bit more stimulating,
Mm.
that's not the quick hit, but actually says I'm rubbish at thinking of examples, but it's not just the procrastination as well. It's like, okay, let's look at I don't know why this has popped in my head for someone who's an athlete. It's like, could you look through, I'm going to go, could you look through Josie's book? Could you understand it? But find something that's like, okay, this might distract you and it might be a bit more purposeful in the long term, but it's quite easy to do. Could you go and listen to
Mm.
something which might help you long term? Could you do some breathing exercises? There could be a whole load of things in there. And then we start to build the understanding of why go to that place and what else could we do instead? What else will fulfill the needs and isn't just that quick hit or isn't built around the response to the negative beliefs about themselves?
And again, on your website, I saw that you work from an ACT approach often. Are you then using values and things to help with that kind of where would we rather be? What's the approach we would when we're feeling logical, when we're feeling in control, when we're not dysregulated, what would we choose to do and what direction would we like to move in?
Yeah, exactly that. Yeah, I do. I can't think of any client, certainly not in the last 2 years, that have never done values work at some point. So we find out what their values is. And that in itself can be, particularly for someone who's neurodivergent and who's always been told how they should be, to
Mm.
actually open out their values can be like, wow, that's me there. And it's okay to be that. So it always feels a real sort of shift with someone when we've just got down to like their sort of top five values, or even understand what values are as well. And then exactly that out with the kind of moments where we're trying to find different coping strategies in the dysregulation. We're looking at, okay, where do you want your life to be? And where
Mm.
does sport fit into this? What's the intention of sport for you? How does that fit with your values? What might be something that you do next time? So you've got a bit of a kind of bank of ideas that when they do get to that point that they're dysregulated, okay, this wouldn't be helpful for me. Remember, this is what I want. So we kind of have this, like, on the one hand, there's this thing that I could go to, which isn't really helping me and isn't towards my values, even though it feels appealing or it feels like it will regulate me or it will help me cope. And here's this other place, which is much more where I want to go longer term. So yeah, I would do a lot of building that in.
And that brings in, obviously, lots of what you're talking about would refer to anyone with ADHD who has disordered eating or an eating disorder. What additional elements does sport throw into the mix?
So, because there is a higher incident of eating disorders within sport, as there's a higher incident of ADHD in sport, and people lean towards that. I think sometimes people I went into sport as a way of enabling my eating disorder, to be honest. Um, so, um, but yeah, so sport, I'm taking a breath to try and kind of gather my thoughts around it because it's quite complex. There's So different areas of sport throw up their own challenges, the
Yeah.
environment of it. So there can be like weight graded sports like
Yep.
judo comes to mind, aesthetic sports, gymnastics. There's the whole there's a whole narrative that used to go on a lot about like being stern, so endurance sports. There's that kind of this is what an endurance athlete's supposed to be like. So there's a
Yeah.
lot of kind of narratives around that, as well as the actual, okay, you have to hit this weight category or there's a body image issues. So that throws stuff into the mix in terms of the environment. And then there can be a pressure sport. So particularly if someone is moving more in performance sport, there's pressures that come from that in terms of I need to be this good. If someone's in professional sport, it's my job. I've got to perform. How can I perform better? I'm going to lose my job and then or not earn money. And then it can become someone's identity as well.
Mm.
So I am a runner. I am an age group athlete who does this. So if I'm not that, then who am I? So I think sport can be absolutely fantastic for building self-esteem. But for some people, their self-esteem and their identity can be founded purely on this. So that's another element that just kind of throws into the mix of if somebody is struggling, here's this handy coping mechanism. Oh, it's an eating
Mm.
disorder. It's how I eat. I can control how I eat. I've been told that I need to look like this. I better control my eating. I don't know how to deal with this pressure. I can't speak to anyone about it, but I'm told that, if I look after my nutrition, then that's a good thing to be doing. And people can take it to the extreme. They're perfectionist as well, which goes along with ADHD. So it can become this real sort of melting pot for food and size being an answer to dealing with all of that. And then taken to the extreme, it becomes an eating disorder and it becomes the only way to cope.
So, bearing all that in mind, when you've got
Mm.
coaches in gymnastics, rowing, judo, climbing, running, cycling, all of those sports that are really impacted by this, what advice would you have for them on how to best look out for their athletes?
I think it's understanding the signs. There is such a fine line between somebody being a dedicated athlete and somebody being dedicated to an eating disorder
Yeah.
and having an eating disorder. I used to lecture in Edinburgh Uni in their sports science department to coaches. And we had this slide where it showed all the traits of a dedicated athlete. And then we layered it with all the traits of an eating disorder, and particularly types that tend to come in sport where there is some kind of restriction or purging or kind of counting along with or without binging. So, and the difference is the self-esteem. So for coaches, it's understanding that, understanding that and recognizing where something changes. So what's happened in this person who was a dedicated athlete, but they're not performing as well. They're isolating themselves a little bit more. Maybe they're a bit quieter. Just their personality starts to change, or they become a bit more obsessed with one area of their training, or they become a bit more obsessed with their nutrition. So understanding that, and then and then having conversations with people. I mean, there's so much education, I think, that needs to be done with coaches and how to approach, because actually a coach can be brilliant for supporting someone with an eating disorder, not in terms of dealing with the actual eating disorder, but supporting that person when they know them. So
Yeah.
knowing this is how this person ticks and how to have conversations. Like I heard you talking about with someone you were interviewing before about knowing that that person who's ADHD isn't going to stand and listen, like, they're going to move about. Let them do that. And I think it's for coaches to kind of recognize, oh, this is what this person does. They're not doing that now. Why is that? What's happening?
Mm.
But when they know that person as well, they can be a real support for the person while they get help or while they seek help, just to know, well, I know you in sports here, and I know sports can be really helpful for you, but we also need to make sure you're well and we need to make sure you're healthy. Does that make
Yes,
sense?
totally. Because I think there's definitely a do no harm bit. And I've had many athletes talk about very careless comments that coaches have made that have triggered
Mm.
eating
Yep.
disorders, particularly because they're so desperate to impress that coach. Whether their coach supports them is kind of whether they're going to make it in their support. And if a coach says something to them, oh, if you just lost a bit of weight, you'd be a bit faster. That's a
Yep.
very instant, quick trigger. That can be really, really painful for them.
Yep.
Um, but there's also that well-being element. I remember speaking to a coach who said, I've got a new rule within my team that if one of the girls on the team loses their period for 2 or more months, they're off training until they've
Mm.
worked on getting their weight back to where it should be. And I was like, wow, that must be some difficult conversations to have and probably quite uncomfortable for a male coach, but also brilliant to see those girls know that you are only allowed to train if you are healthy enough to train,
Yep.
and you have to feel well enough to be healthy enough. So it just sets a whole tone within a group that moves
Absolutely.
us far away from that previous kind of the lighter is faster kind of
Yep.
um
Yeah.
and
Or you must be working really hard that you've not got your period. Like
ah
there used to be a time of, oh, well done. Like you must be working super hard.
massively. When I started in triathlon, it was like a badge of honor not to get your period.
Yeah.
That was that maybe 20 years ago, but it was a real thing, like, oh, you're a real athlete, you work so hard. Whereas
Yeah.
now to see that turned on its head of like it, losing that weight might be effective for a couple of weeks and you might get your PB and then you're
Mm.
broken and then you're out for 6 months with a stress fracture. That's
Absolutely.
not how you have a good sporting career. Is amazing to see. um what I really love there actually is you saying the difference between the characteristics of someone with an eating disorder and the characteristics of a dedicated athlete is self-esteem. And I think
Yeah.
if the more coaches understand that,
Mhm.
and particularly with ADHD, where somebody's probably spent a lot of time being criticized, to
Yeah.
focus on actually my job as a coach is not just to get them moving in a certain way or to teach certain patterns of movement or skills. It is to
Mhm.
give someone the highest level of self-esteem that they can have so that it's a protection from an eating disorder, but it's also going to mean they get the best out of themselves.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I love that. I'm going to use that phrase. It's a protection from an eating disorder, but it is. They don't exist where someone's got good self-esteem. And the whole process of recovery is building self-esteem in someone. But yeah, I think often it is focused on exactly like you say, the skill. And that's great. And people with ADHD can be brilliant at that sort of skill-based stuff as well. But if it's with a low self-esteem, and for instance, if they get injured, and then they're not able to do this stuff, they're not able to move as well, that's kind of harboring some ground for
Yeah.
potential an eating disorder. So like that example you gave of, okay, they're not participating in training if they've lost their period for 2 months, absolutely brilliant because it's focused on their well-being. But it's also, I mean, depends on the team, depends on the level, how doable this is. But also to keep someone in the sport and be like, you are part of this team still, but we need to get you well, is there's something quite accepting about that as well. We're looking after you, we're looking after your well-being. We want you in this team. We're not isolating you, we're not dismissing you, because someone with ADHD may well have spent their life being
Mm.
dismissed. And then when you add in rejection sensitivity as well, to have someone even sort of sit on the benches, watch, participate, be in that place, if it's manageable, can be really helpful for someone with an eating disorder as well, as they go and get help, but they know sport's there. So as a therapist, if that happens, I love it, because I'm like, well, you can't do your sport just now, but sport's there. Our purpose
Yeah.
is to get you back to sport. We need you to be willing to go back to sport. So you haven't taken away a really healthy coping strategy in terms of sport's good for me and it's good for my ADHD and it's good for my well-being. Having an eating disorder is not. So how can we get you back and where it does become healthy again?
And finally, when I work with an athlete as sports psych, and many have had eating disorders in their past, there tends to be a real split between people talking about you can fully recover from an eating disorder, or that
Mm-hmm.
eating disorder is always still there somewhere and you're always in recovery, but you'll never recover.
Mm-hmm.
What's your view on that?
Mm-hmm.
What do you tend to see?
I believe you can absolutely fully recover from it. Fully recover. It will always be part of your history and it'll always be part of you knowing yourself. But because that place of recovering is all about understanding self and understanding who you are, you can reach a place where it's just not there. Yeah. So there definitely was a narrative for a long time of it'll always be there, it'll always be in your thinking. I think what's happened with that is people have taken it to a place of, well, we'll get you so far that it's manageable. You'll always have to manage food, you'll always have to manage behaviors. But again, that for me is like, well, you've always got to manage it this way, because eating disorder recovery used to be quite structured and it
Yeah.
was a process you followed. Whereas now it's changed, and particularly now we know that neurodivergence is so linked with it. It is much more person-centered. It is much more who's this person? How are they going to process it? How can we help them get centered? So I think there's more people saying recovery, full recovery is completely possible. And the more we link it in with understanding neurodivergence, yeah, absolutely. And one of the things I've just thought about just now, because also one in terms of, so we all have traits, okay? Neurodivergent traits are different from neurotypical traits, and neurodivergent, one person's traits are different from another. So if we can accept these traits, that person gets to know their traits, then people can learn where their assets and where their
Yeah.
liabilities. So this is here with you. So rather than talking about them super strengths and all that kind of stuff, like, this is you. Now we're using this as a liability or is it an asset? What would be the difference? Where do you want to direct it to? Which fits in with the values again. And when you give someone that empowerment, they can absolutely fully recover from an eating disorder.
Amazing. Thank you. So if someone's watching